We live in interesting times. Today's stories. Central African peace deal hailed by President and African Union. Guaido orders the army to allow aid into Venezuela. Nearly 200 Bangladeshis crammed into Indonesia's shop house. Italy's Conte discusses ISIS insurgency with Iraqi leaders. Maduro supporters asked Trump to keep his hands off Venezuela. Trump was running for re-election during State of the Union speech. Trump announces controversial pick Malpass to lead World Bank. Trump expects ISIS caliphate defeated in 1 week. Plus, Catriona Gray wants to be remembered as a Miss Universe who had advocacy at her core. Hello everyone, I'm Anna Kui, bringing you stories from around the globe, and this is Eagle News, Washington, D.C. The government of Central African Republic and armed groups in control of most of the country signed a deal in Bangui Wednesday aimed at ending a bloody years-long conflict. President Faustin Archange Touadéra said at the signing ceremony, without disclosing the contents of the pact, the first effect of this agreement is the cessation of all violence against civilians.
Et l'histoire nous jugera sévèrement si nous manquions à nos responsabilités. Cette date historique nous met face à nos responsabilités. Ensemble, dans la célébration de notre diversité et le respect de la différence, je vous invite à nous mettre à l'œuvre pour bâtir une République centrafricaine nouvelle.
The deal had been initialed in Khartoum on Tuesday after lengthy talks brokered by the African Union and supported by the United Nations. The leaders of the two biggest armed groups, Ali Darassa of the Unity for Peace in Central African Republic and Nuruddin Adam of the Popular Front for the Renaissance of the Central African Republic, initialed the text in Khartoum but were not present for Wednesday's signing ceremony. The accord is the eighth attempt in nearly 6 years to forge peace in the war-ravaged country, one of the poorest in the world. The conflict has left thousands dead and forced a quarter of the population of 4.5 million from their homes. The UN warned last year the rural exodus could drive the country into famine. All 7 previous peace agreements failed to stick. The CAR plunged into crisis in 2012 when a mainly Muslim rebel movement called the Seleka rose in the north of the country. The following year, the insurgents overthrew President François Bozizé. France, the former colonial ruler, intervened militarily under a UN mandate as fears grew of Rwandan-style genocide. The Seleka were forced from power, and in February 2016, Touadéra, a former prime minister, was elected president. However, militia, often portraying themselves as defenders of a community or religious group, still control some 80% of the country. Fighting often erupts between these forces over control of the country's lavish mineral resources, which range from gold and diamonds to uranium. Touadéra is supported by 13,000 troops and police in the United Nations MINUSCA mission, one of the UN's biggest peacekeeping operations.
Ce jour est un grand jour pour la RCA, pour l'Afrique et pour les infatigables chevaliers de l'initiative africaine que nous avons lancée, non sans pertinence depuis 2016, en vue d'un accord de paix et de réconciliation en République centrafricaine.
C'est la paix qu'on a ramenée du Soudan, du Khartoum, la concorde, l'unité nationale et la réconciliation nationale.
During a meeting with farmers, Venezuelan opposition leader orders the military forces to allow the humanitarian aid into Venezuela.
A las Fuerzas Armadas, una orden directa en este momento. Permitan que entre y que ingrese la necesaria ayuda humanitaria para atender a su familia. Porque en los próximos días, la ayuda humanitaria empieza a ingresar para un sector de la población muy vulnerable. Iniciamos el proceso de articulación con los sectores productivos porque también tenemos que pensar una vez cese la usurpación en esos primeros 30 días que garantice abastecimiento, que garantice inicio de la producción. Tenemos que pensar.
Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido stepped up efforts Wednesday to win recognition from EU holdout states and insisted the armed forces allow desperately needed humanitarian aid to enter the country. Guaido said, "Today we talked with representatives of the EU to consolidate their support for the democratic transition." He added that he would send a delegation to holdout state Italy to present his action plan to relaunch democracy. The National Assembly leader has been recognized by more than 40 countries since declaring himself interim president on January 23rd in defiance of President Nicolas Maduro. However, several countries, including Italy and Greece, have so far blocked an EU bid for tougher action against Maduro's socialist regime. U.S. President of State Mike Pompeo, meanwhile, demanded Venezuela's military allow aid into the country. Pompeo tweeted, "The Maduro regime must let the aid reach the starving people." In Geneva, the International Committee of the Red Cross said it was doubling its resources to cope with the crisis, where food and medicine shortages have pushed 2.3 million people to flee since 2015. ICRC Chief Peter Maurer said, quote, "Our focus is really to, on one side, increase our response to Venezuelans, and on the other hand, to keep away from the political controversy and political divisions which are characteristic to the crisis in Venezuela." Maduro, who is supported by Russia, China, Turkey, Cuba, and Iran, has refused all humanitarian aid shipments to Venezuela, which he says would open the way to allow a U.S. military invasion. Key to the delivery of humanitarian aid is Venezuela's armed forces, which remain loyal to the socialist leader. Late Tuesday, the army blocked a road on the Colombian border near where U.S. humanitarian aid is being stockpiled. Troops used a tanker trunk and huge shipping container to block access to the Tienditas Bridge, which links Cucuta, Colombia, to Urina, Venezuela. Guaido said in an interview on Colombian radio, Venezuela's army have an important responsibility, whether to continue on the side of a dictatorship that does not have an iota of humanity or to side with the constitution. He claims that up to 300,000 people face death if the aid is not delivered. Maduro dismissed the need for aid on Wednesday as a, quote, "political show." He told Russia today, "Imperialism does not help anyone in the world." 56-year-old Maduro has repeatedly accused the United States of fomenting a coup. And on Wednesday, he called for the collection of 10 million signatures against what he called Trump's interventionist action. The U.S., which has not ruled out a military intervention in crisis-racked Venezuela, was the first to recognize his rival as acting president, followed by a dozen Latin American countries. In his State of the Union address Tuesday night, President Donald Trump reaffirmed U.S. support for Guaido, saying, quote, "We stand with the Venezuelan people in their noble quest for freedom." Authorities said Wednesday almost 200 men identified by police as Bangladeshi had been found crammed into a shop house in Indonesia. Authorities said when police raided the shop house on Tuesday, they found some 192 men, mostly in their 20s, occupying this two-story building with many complaining about lack of food. Officials said they believed the men had arrived from Bangladesh and were living in the cramped quarters for several months in the hopes of going to neighboring Malaysia for work. Head of Medan Immigration Ferry Monang Sihait said they might have arrived by boat and they don't have any documents.
Lepas sini kita abangan tangkapan kan, gari kan, itu tempat ada 2 hari. 22 hari sajalah. Itu agenan banyak tipu sama kita. Kita mau naik pesawat Malaysia, tapi dia orang buat ini macam 3 negara kena pusing kita. Kalau cerita lebih kita, makanan tak kasih cukupan, kasih pukul, kasih sepa, ini macam buat. Semua orang budak, semua ini kita orang barang semua turun, tak ada tenaga, tak ada kuat, makanan tak kasih cukupan.
It was not immediately clear who owned the building or what role they may have played in the affair. In recent years, Indonesia has seen hundreds of asylum seekers mostly Afghans and minority Rohingya from Myanmar, arrive in the northern part of Sumatra. In 2015, hundreds of Muslim Rohingya arrived ashore in Aceh, where they were welcomed in the staunchly conservative Islamic province. Indonesia has not ratified the UN Convention on Refugees, and asylum seekers are usually not allowed to work in the country. Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte visited Baghdad on Wednesday, meeting his Iraqi counterpart Adel Abdel Mahdi and President Barham Saleh for talks on the fight against the Islamic State group. Conte told reporters in Iraq's capital, using an Arab acronym for ISIS, quote, "Iraqi efforts to defeat Daesh have been fundamental. But we must be conscious that the Daesh insurgency still constitutes a serious threat that requires vigilant attention and a collective effort." ISIS seized swathes of Iraq in a lightning offensive in 2014, prompting a grueling Iraqi operation backed by an international coalition that includes Italy. Baghdad finally declared victory over the jihadists in December 2017. However, ISIS maintains sleeper cells, including along the border with Syria, and has carried out periodic hit-and-run attacks. Conte was latest in a string of Western leaders to visit Iraq in recent weeks, including U.S. President Donald Trump, who sparked outrage by failing to meet a single Iraqi official. Conte and Iraqi officials also discussed economic reconstruction and the preservation of Iraq's cultural heritage. The Italian premier said his country was helping to train the Iraqi police and was lending its expertise to help UNESCO preserve historical treasures in a country that boasts 5 World Heritage Sites. His visit came days after Claudio Descalzi, the CEO of Italian oil giant Eni, met Iraq's oil minister Tamer Abbas Ghadbain in Baghdad. Eni says it operates 475,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day in Iraq. Coming up, Maduro supporters asked Trump to keep his hands off Venezuela. Trump was running for re-election during State of the Union speech. Trump announces controversial pick Malpass to lead World Bank. Trump expects ISIS caliphate defeated in 1 week. Eagle News, Washington, D.C. will be right back. Welcome back. You are watching Eagle News, Washington, D.C. Hundreds of government supporters gather in Venezuela's capital to sign a petition titled Hands Off Venezuela, requesting the United States government to stop the threats of intervention against the government of Venezuela and to show support for Nicolás Maduro.
No queremos la injerencia de los gringos aquí, y por eso estamos aquí en contra, firmando a favor del presidente Maduro y en contra de Guaidó.
La recolección de firmas es algo importante para demostrarle a Donald Trump que Venezuela ni nos chupamos el dedo y no somos tontos. No.
Manifestando apoyo a nuestro presidente Nicolás Maduro, a nuestra democracia, a nuestro proceso revolucionario, ante esta interferencia, este golpe de Estado que desde el imperio se está desarrollando aquí en el país, utilizando títeres como Juan Guaidó, o como se llame, que no llega a ser presidente ni siquiera en su casa.
President Donald Trump's national security advisor said Wednesday Washington is prepared to exempt Venezuelan military leaders from punitive sanctions if they recognize opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the South American nation's interim leader. John Bolton said on Twitter, the U.S. will consider sanctions off-ramps for any Venezuelan senior military officer that stands for democracy and recognizes the constitutional government of President Juan Guaidó, urging the officers to make the right choice and align with Guaidó instead of embattled President Nicolás Maduro. He said, if not, the international financial circle will be closed off completely. The remarks align with those of Trump, who pledged in his State of the Union address Tuesday night to ramp up pressure on Maduro's socialist government, telling Congress that we stand with the Venezuelan people in their noble quest for freedom. An analyst says U.S. President Donald Trump's address about the State of the Union was a fundraising speech for the president who was speaking to his political base. George Washington University professor Michael Cornfield describes a confrontational situation with the president facing Democrat female members dressed in white.
Yesterday was confrontational. It featured a president who was largely speaking to his Republican base and Democrats, many women dressed in white, who were speaking to their political base. The message that the House members were sending by wearing white if they were women and by wearing white ribbons if they were men was, we are united. We are united on a variety of issues, but we are particularly united against you. I think what he wants is for his Republican associates and followers to think that he made a good effort and that the Democrats are at fault. It is not a loser-loser situation if you look at the speech as a fundraising speech. He will get more money for his 2020 defense of his presidency because of the stands he took on immigration, on abortion, on socialism, on the economy. He was running for re-election last night. He, again, is doing this more to show his base that he is a world leader and that he is trying to do things than actually accomplishing anything.
U.S. President Donald Trump announces David Malpass as his controversial pick to lead the World Bank. Trump on Wednesday tapped a World Bank critic described as a happy warrior of pro-growth policies to lead one of the world's primary development lending institutions.
I knew that David was the right person to take this incredibly important job. In addition to his current service, overseeing the IMF and actually overseeing the World Bank as Undersecretary of International Affairs at the Department of the Treasury, David brings 40 years of experience in economics, finance, government, and foreign policy.
David Malpass, a senior official in the Treasury Department, is a controversial choice, but if Trump wins the support of a majority of the bank's shareholders, especially European nations, he will have the opportunity to reshape the bank. Trump called Malpass an extraordinary man who and the right person to take this incredibly important job.
America is the largest contributor to the World Bank, giving it over $1 billion every year. My administration has made it a top priority to ensure that U.S. taxpayers' dollars are spent effectively and wisely, serve American interests, and defend American values. David has been a strong advocate for accountability at the World Bank for a long time.
Trump and his team have attacked multilateral institutions in the 2 years he has been in office, and Malpass has led the charge against the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Malpass has called the international financial institutions' lending practices corrupt and complained about financing to China and other relatively more well-off countries that he says should have graduated from the institutions. Speaking at the White House, Malpass said he would seek to implement reforms approved last year after negotiations to increase the bank's lending capital by $13 billion, such as curbing loans to and charging higher interest to higher income countries like China.
At Treasury, I'm proud to say that under your administration, Mr. President, we negotiated a major capital increase and reform package for the World Bank. With shareholders and dedicated staff, there's a great opportunity now to implement these constructive reforms that will lead to faster growth and greater prosperity. I want to also note that a key goal will be to ensure that women achieve full participation in developing economies.
Senior administration officials told reporters that Malpass and the Trump administration support these multilateral lenders when they efficiently fulfill their missions. One official called Malpass a happy warrior and champion of pro-growth policies who is dedicated to bringing economic growth to low-income countries. However, they confirmed that Malpass, who is part of the delegation engaged in high-stakes trade talks with Beijing, would advocate for a wind-down of lending to China, which they said had sufficient resources of its own. The surprise early departure of World Bank President Jim Yong Kim, effective February 1st, not even halfway through his second five-year term, gives Trump the opportunity to put his stamp on the organization. Beginning Thursday, the bank's board will accept nominations until March 14 and plans to name a new president prior to the IMF and World Bank spring meetings set for April 12th to the 14th in Washington. Any of the 189 members can propose a candidate. U.S. President Donald Trump, who has declared victory over the Islamic State group, said Wednesday that he expected the extremists to lose all the remaining territory in Syria around a week.
The United States military, our coalition partners, and the Syrian Democratic Forces have liberated virtually all of the territory previously held by ISIS in Syria and Iraq. It should be formally announced sometime, probably next week, that we will have 100% of the caliphate. They'll be informing us very soon, officially, that it's 100%. ISIS can no longer claim widespread ownership over local governments in Syria and Iraq. Now, you're always going to have people. They'll be around. They're sick. They're demented. But you're going to have them no matter how well we do militarily.
When we come back, Catriona Gray wants to be remembered as a Miss Universe who had advocacy at her core. Eagle News Washington, D.C. will return shortly. News Washington, D.C. I'm Anna Cui. Speaking at a meet and greet hosted by the Philippine Consulate General in New York, Miss Universe 2019 Catriona Gray said she hopes to be remembered as a Miss Universe who has advocacy at her core. Joanne Blanco Soriano reports.
At a time when positive role models are getting harder and harder to find, the world once again turned its eyes to the Philippines, with the crowning of Catriona Gray as Miss Universe. This beauty queen is a fierce advocate for different charities and causes, and plans to use her title to do even more. Now living in New York, Catriona appeared at a meet and greet at the Philippine Consulate in Midtown.
Being a Miss Universe, I'm not just focusing on the Philippines any longer. I really do want to expand my reach, whether that means working with different organizations around the world, but even learning from them. Maybe a certain country, like here in the States, has applied a certain program in regards to HIV, for example, that I could learn from and perhaps suggest back at home in the Philippines. You know, I want to have that role as a Miss Universe, and I'm sure this year I will definitely have the opportunity to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joanne Soriano, Eagle Broadcasting.
Hi, Joanne.
How do you want to be remembered during your reign, and how will you know that you were successful?
I want to be remembered as a Miss Universe who really had advocacy at her core, because that's really who I've been for the last 3 years. I'm more than happy to do the events and the photo shoots and the glamorous side, but I want to be remembered for the work that I did for the charities, because that for me, as a human being, not as a title holder, is fulfilling. That's what makes me go to bed at night and feel like I've done something worthwhile. And if I can be successful in raising a certain amount of money or impacting a certain group of people in such a way, then I'll look back on my year and say that I did a good job.
Reporting from the Philippine Center in New York, this is Joanne Soriano, 1 with 25.
Thanks, Joanne. That is today's Eagle News, Washington, D.C. Join us tomorrow for stories that matter to you. Visit our websites at Eaglenews.PH and EagleNewsLive.com. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Twitter.com/EagleNewsPH. Thank you for watching. I'm Anna Cui, and I am 1 with 25.